So, what if I told you that one of Hollywood's most perfect marriages didn't just quietly end, but actually exploded behind the scenes in a way nobody saw coming? Yeah, we're talking about Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban, the couple everyone thought was untouchable, unbreakable, basically relationship goals 24/7. But here's the twist nobody was ready for. What if the real reason behind their sudden divorce wasn't distance, wasn't busy schedules, but something, or should I say someone, way more shocking? Enter Naomi Watts. Yep, that Naomi Watts. Now ask yourself this. Why was she suddenly being spotted near Keith's private residence? Why were insiders whispering about late-night visits, closed doors, and conversations that lasted till sunrise? And the biggest question of all, why did Nicole find out about all of this not from the media, but from Keith's OWN mother? Let that sink in. Was this a secret relationship hiding in plain sight? Or a full-blown betrayal that's about to shake Hollywood to its core? Because what we uncovered next is way messier than anyone expected. The story didn't begin with headlines or paparazzi flashes. It began with silence, the kind of silence that feels louder than any argument, the kind that creeps into a home and settles into the walls, and that's exactly what people close to Nicole Kidman started noticing long before the public had any clue. At first, everything looked normal on the surface, carefully curated appearances, polite smiles at events, the usual scripted answers during interviews, but behind that polished exterior something was shifting, something subtle but deeply unsettling. Sources began whispering that Nicole had grown distant, not cold exactly, but distracted, like her mind was somewhere else even when she was physically present, and when you look back now, those early signs feel less like coincidence and more like the beginning of a slow unraveling. Meanwhile, Keith Urban seemed different too, but in a way that didn't quite match the narrative of a crumbling marriage. Instead of appearing stressed or emotionally drained, he looked lighter, almost energized, like someone who had quietly stepped out of a storm while everyone else was still standing in the rain. That contrast alone raised eyebrows among insiders, because when a long-term relationship begins to collapse, both sides usually show signs of strain, but here, the imbalance was impossible to ignore. One person close to the situation reportedly described it as two completely different realities unfolding at the same time, and that's where things started to get interesting. What made it even more suspicious was how quickly everything escalated. There were no dramatic public fights, no messy social media exchanges, no cryptic posts hinting at heartbreak, just a sudden shift from togetherness to separation, like someone had flipped a switch behind the scenes. And while fans were left confused, trying to piece together what went wrong, those on the inside were already connecting dots that hadn't yet reached the public eye. Because as it turns out, the story wasn't just about a marriage ending, it was about what was happening during that marriage, quietly, discreetly, and far away from the cameras. That's when the name Naomi Watts started surfacing in conversations that were never meant to leave private circles. At first, it was just a mention here and there, a casual reference that didn't seem significant enough to raise alarms, but then the mentions became more frequent, more specific, and harder to dismiss. People began to notice patterns, timings that didn't quite add up, coincidences that felt a little too convenient, and suddenly, what once seemed like harmless speculation started taking on a more serious tone. According to multiple insider accounts, Naomi's presence around Keith wasn't as occasional as one might expect from a casual acquaintance. In fact, it was described as consistent, almost routine, which immediately raised questions about boundaries and intentions. And here's where the situation takes a turn that no one could have predicted, because while the public remained completely unaware, there were already whispers about late-night visits, private conversations, and an undeniable closeness that went far beyond friendship. These weren't just rumors fueled by imagination. These were observations coming from people who had nothing to gain by speaking up, and everything to lose if they were wrong. But the most shocking part of all wasn't the secrecy, it was who ultimately revealed it. Because in a twist that feels almost too dramatic to be real, the person who brought this hidden dynamic into the light wasn't a journalist, wasn't a friend, and definitely wasn't the media, it was someone from within Keith's own family. When Nicole Kidman reportedly heard the truth from Marianne Urban, the reaction wasn't just disbelief, it was a mix of shock, anger, and a kind of emotional disorientation that only comes from realizing you've been the last person to know something everyone else has already accepted. Imagine that moment for a second. being told that while you were trying to hold your marriage together, someone else had already stepped into a space you didn't even know was being vacated. And not just anyone, but someone you likely trusted, someone who had been around, someone who had access. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was layered, complex, and deeply unsettling. Because it forced Nicole to confront a reality that had been unfolding right in front of her, hidden behind polite interactions and carefully maintained appearances. As more details began to surface, the situation only became more complicated. There were claims that Naomi had been visiting Keith's home regularly, not for brief, casual meetings, but for extended periods, sometimes staying late into the night, sometimes leaving early in the morning, always at times that suggested a level of comfort and familiarity that couldn't easily be explained away. And while none of this was happening in the public eye, it was happening in a space that was supposed to be private, secure, and shared, which only added to the sense of intrusion and betrayal. What makes this even more intriguing is how long it reportedly went unnoticed, or at least unaddressed. Because in situations like this, there are usually signs, subtle shifts in behavior, unexplained absences, changes in routine, and according to sources, those signs were there all along. The problem was that they were either dismissed, misunderstood, or simply overshadowed by the demands of a high-profile life where appearances often take precedence over reality. And by the time those signs could no longer be ignored, the situation had already progressed beyond the point of quiet resolution. For Nicole, the realization didn't just bring answers, it brought a cascade of new questions. How long had this been going on, who else knew, and perhaps most painfully, why hadn't she been told sooner? Those questions didn't just linger, they demanded attention, and as she began to piece together the timeline, the picture that emerged was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't a single moment of betrayal, it was a series of choices, actions, and omissions that collectively reshaped the entire narrative of what their relationship had been. And yet, despite all of this, Keith's reaction remained surprisingly consistent. He didn't appear shaken, didn't attempt to publicly address the growing speculation, and certainly didn't show the kind of visible remorse that many would expect in such a situation. Instead, he maintained a level of composure that some interpreted as confidence, and others saw as indifference. Either way, it added another layer of mystery to an already complicated story, because it suggested that whatever was happening behind the scenes, it wasn't affecting him in the same way it was affecting Nicole. As the tension continued to build, those close to the situation began to notice a shift in Nicole's demeanor. The quiet distraction that had once been subtle became more pronounced, the emotional weight more visible, and the effort required to maintain a sense of normalcy more apparent. It wasn't just a personal struggle anymore, it was something that was starting to spill over into her public life, affecting her interactions, her presence, and the way she carried herself. And for someone who had spent years mastering the art of composure, that shift did not go unnoticed. At this point, the story was no longer just about a marriage ending, it was about what had led to that ending, and more importantly, what had been hidden along the way. The pieces were starting to come together, but the full picture was still incomplete, leaving room for speculation, interpretation, and a growing sense of anticipation about what might be revealed next. Because if this was just the beginning, then what else was still waiting to come to light, and how much deeper did this situation really go? And how much deeper this situation really went was a question that refused to stay quiet, because the more people started looking, the more unsettling the details became, almost like pulling on a thread that just wouldn't stop unraveling. What initially seemed like a quiet separation was now being re-examined through a completely different lens, one that painted a far more complicated and controversial picture. Insiders who had previously stayed silent began to speak, not publicly, not on record, but enough to create a ripple effect that slowly started turning into a wave. According to these sources, the connection between Keith Urban and Naomi Watts was not something that suddenly appeared after the divorce, it had been developing quietly, gradually, and with a level of discretion that suggested intention rather than coincidence. There were accounts of private meetings that didn't quite align with professional obligations, late-night phone calls that extended far beyond casual conversation, and a pattern of interactions that began to form a timeline, one that overlapped uncomfortably with the final months of Keith's marriage to Nicole Kidman. And while none of these details were officially confirmed, the consistency of these reports made them difficult to ignore. It wasn't just one person making a claim, it was multiple voices, each adding a piece to a puzzle that was starting to look less like speculation and more like something that had been carefully kept out of view. One particularly striking account described how Naomi's visits to Keith's residence became more frequent during a period when Nicole was often away due to work commitments. At first glance, that might not seem unusual. After all, both individuals operate in industries where collaboration and networking are part of daily life, but the nature and timing of these visits raised questions. These weren't daytime meetings or brief check-ins. They were described as extended stays, often beginning late in the evening and continuing into the early hours of the morning. And perhaps most tellingly, they were conducted with a level of privacy that suggested an awareness of how they might be perceived if exposed. Then came the reports about the atmosphere inside the house during these visits, and this is where the narrative takes on an almost cinematic quality. Sources claimed that when Naomi was present, the dynamic shifted completely. The environment became more relaxed, more intimate, almost as if the space itself was being redefined. There were mentions of music playing late into the night, long conversations that carried on behind closed doors, and a sense of comfort that seemed to go beyond the boundaries of a casual friendship. These weren't just isolated incidents, they were part of a pattern, one that painted a picture of a relationship that had been growing in the shadows. Public reaction, once these whispers began to circulate more widely, was exactly what you would expect, a mixture of disbelief, curiosity, and a relentless desire to know more. Social media platforms became flooded with theories, timelines, and amateur investigations, with users dissecting every available detail, from past public appearances to subtle changes in behavior that now seemed far more significant in hindsight. People began revisiting interviews, analyzing body language, and drawing connections that had previously gone unnoticed. It was as if the entire narrative was being reconstructed in real time, with each new piece of information adding another layer of complexity. Some voices expressed sympathy for Nicole, highlighting the emotional toll of discovering such a situation from an external source rather than directly from the people involved. Others focused on the perceived betrayal, questioning how something like this could have been concealed for so long, especially within such a high-profile environment where privacy is both a luxury and a challenge. And then there were those who approached the situation with a more skeptical perspective, questioning the validity of the claims and pointing out the lack of concrete evidence. But even among the skeptics, there was an acknowledgement that the story, as it was unfolding, was difficult to. What added fuel to the fire were the so-called leaked insights from individuals who claimed to have been present during some of these interactions. One anonymous source described a particular evening where the atmosphere between Keith and Naomi was described as undeniably close, noting that their body language, tone, and level of engagement suggested a connection that went beyond what one would expect from colleagues or casual acquaintances. Another account mentioned how staff members within the residence reportedly adjusted their routines during these visits, maintaining a level of distance and discretion that indicated an understanding of the situation, even if it was never openly discussed. And then there was the financial angle, because no high-profile controversy is complete without speculation about money, influence, and power. Some reports suggested that there were unusual expenditures linked to private arrangements, discreet travel, and accommodations that didn't align with publicly known schedules. While these claims remain unverified, they added another dimension to the story, one that hinted at the possibility of a carefully managed situation designed to remain hidden from both the public and certain individuals within their personal circles. Meanwhile, Nicole Kidman found herself at the center of a storm that she hadn't anticipated, not just dealing with the emotional impact of the revelations, but also navigating the growing public interest in a situation that was deeply personal. Reports suggested that she began withdrawing from certain engagements, limiting her appearances, and focusing on maintaining a sense of control in a situation that felt anything but controlled. Those close to her described a period of intense reflection, where the focus shifted from understanding what had happened to deciding how to respond. On the other side, Keith Urban maintained a level of composure that continued to raise questions. There were no dramatic statements, no attempts to publicly clarify or deny the allegations, just a steady presence that seemed almost detached from the chaos unfolding around him. For some, this was interpreted as a sign of confidence, perhaps even a belief that the situation would eventually settle on its own. For others, it was seen as a lack of accountability, a refusal to engage with a narrative that was rapidly gaining momentum. And then there was Naomi Watts, whose position in all of this remained both central and elusive. While her name was being discussed more frequently, her direct involvement remained largely unaddressed in any official capacity. This absence of response only added to the intrigue, creating a space where speculation could thrive and assumptions could take root. Was the silence a strategic choice, a way to avoid escalating the situation, or was it an indication that there was more to the story than what was currently being revealed? As the narrative continued to evolve, one thing became increasingly clear: this was no longer just a private matter between three individuals. It had transformed into a public spectacle, a story that people were invested in, not just for the drama, but for what it represented. It touched on themes of trust, secrecy, and the complexities of relationships in a world where privacy is constantly under pressure. And with each new detail, each new perspective, the story moved closer to a point where it could no longer be contained, where the consequences of what had been hidden would have to be faced, one way or another. But if the revelations so far had already shaken the narrative, what was coming next had the potential to change everything. Because the focus was about to shift from what had happened in private to how it would be addressed in public, and that's where things tend to get even more unpredictable. And that unpredictability is exactly where the story took its most intense turn, because once something like this crosses from private whispers into public consciousness, it stops being just a relationship issue and starts becoming a full-scale fallout scenario. The kind that doesn't just affect emotions but reputations, careers, and carefully built public images. What had once been quietly contained within the walls of a home was now echoing across media platforms, and the pressure to respond, clarify, or at least acknowledge what was happening was growing by the hour. The question was no longer just what happened, but what happens next, and for Nicole Kidman, that question carried a weight that went far beyond public curiosity. According to emerging reports, discussions around potential legal consultations had already begun behind the scenes. While nothing was officially confirmed, insiders suggested that Nicole's team was exploring options, not necessarily to escalate the situation publicly, but to understand the full scope of her position, both personally and professionally. Because when a situation involves overlapping timelines, alleged secrecy, and a potential breach of trust at this level, it's not just about emotional closure, it's about protecting one's narrative before it gets rewritten by everyone else. And in a world where perception can be just as powerful as reality, that kind of control becomes essential. At the same time, there were whispers of internal tensions within circles connected to Keith Urban, not dramatic confrontations or public disputes, but subtle shifts in loyalty, quiet distancing, and a noticeable change in how certain individuals chose to engage with the situation. Some sources hinted at disagreements behind closed doors, where opinions differed on how things had been handled, not just in terms of the relationship itself, but in the way it had been allowed to unfold without clear boundaries. These weren't explosive conflicts, but they added to the sense that the situation was creating ripples far beyond the immediate individuals involved. Financial speculation also began to intensify, because in high-profile separations, money often becomes part of the narrative whether it belongs there or not. There were discussions about shared assets, potential settlements, and the long-term implications of a split that had taken on such a public dimension. Analysts and commentators, many of whom had no direct connection to the situation, began offering their own interpretations, projecting possible outcomes based on patterns seen in other high-profile cases. While much of this remained hypothetical, it contributed to the growing sense that this was no longer just a personal matter. It was becoming a case study in how private relationships can collide with public scrutiny. Meanwhile, Naomi Watts remained an enigma in the unfolding narrative. Her continued silence, whether intentional or circumstantial, only amplified the curiosity surrounding her role in all of this. Some observers interpreted it as a calculated decision, a way to avoid adding fuel to an already volatile situation. Others saw it as a sign that there were layers to the story that had yet to be revealed, details that might complicate the narrative even further if they were brought into the light. Either way, her absence from direct commentary created a vacuum that was quickly filled by speculation, theory, and endless analysis. Public backlash, as expected, began to take shape in waves. There were those who rallied behind Nicole, framing her as someone who had been blindsided by a situation she didn't create, someone dealing with the emotional aftermath of a deeply personal revelation that had been exposed in a way she couldn't control. Social media posts expressed support, empathy, and in some cases, outrage on her behalf, questioning how something like this could have been allowed to develop without her knowledge. At the same time, there were voices that took a more neutral stance, urging caution, pointing out that without confirmed details, it was easy to construct narratives that might not fully reflect reality. For Keith Urban, the reaction was more divided. Some defended his right to move on, arguing that relationships are complex and that not everything can be understood from the outside. Others were far more critical, focusing on the timing, the secrecy, and the perceived lack of transparency. The contrast between these perspectives created a kind of tension within the public discourse, where the same set of events could be interpreted in completely different ways depending on where one stood. And that tension only added to the intensity of the situation, making it clear that there would be no simple resolution. What made this phase of the story particularly compelling was the sense that everything was still in motion. There was no clear endpoint, no definitive statement that could bring closure, just a series of developments that continued to evolve, each one adding a new dimension to an already complex narrative. Industry insiders began speculating about long-term consequences, not just in terms of personal relationships, but in terms of professional collaborations, public image, and the broader impact on how these individuals would be perceived moving forward. In an environment where reputation can influence opportunity, those considerations carry significant weight. There were even murmurs about potential formal inquiries, not in a legal sense necessarily, but in terms of contractual obligations, professional boundaries, and whether any lines had been crossed in ways that could have broader implications. While these discussions remained largely speculative, they highlighted the extent to which the situation had expanded beyond its original scope. What began as a private dynamic between individuals had now reached a point where it intersected with larger systems, expectations, and standards. And through it all, the emotional core of the story remained impossible to ignore. Because beneath the layers of speculation, analysis, and public reaction, there was still a human element, a series of choices, consequences, and realizations that had fundamentally altered the lives of those involved. For Nicole Kidman, the journey from uncertainty to awareness to response was not just a narrative arc, it was a lived experience, one that would likely continue to unfold long after the headlines moved on to something else. As the situation continued to develop, one thing became increasingly clear: this was not a story that would fade quietly. Too many questions remained unanswered, too many perspectives still needed to be heard, and too much attention had already been drawn for it to simply disappear. Whether it would lead to public statements, private resolutions, or something in between remained to be seen, but the impact was already undeniable. The narrative had shifted, the perceptions had changed, and the consequences, whatever form they ultimately took, were now part of a story that had captured attention in a way few could have predicted. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all is that even now, with everything that has been revealed, there is still a lingering sense that not all of it has come to light, that there are still details waiting in the background, moments that haven't yet been connected, and truths that may never be fully known. Because in stories like this, the surface is rarely the full picture, and what lies beneath often holds the answers that everyone is still searching for. So where does this leave us? What is the real truth behind this entire situation involving Nicole Kidman, Keith Urban, and Naomi Watts? Is this just another Hollywood rumor blown out of proportion? Or are we looking at something much deeper that has been carefully hidden until now? Because if even a fraction of these claims turn out to be true, then this isn't just a story about a breakup. It's a full-blown emotional and personal scandal with layers that we're only beginning to understand. And the biggest question still remains unanswered. How much of this was coincidence, and how much was intentional? Now we want to hear from you. Do you believe this story? Do you think there's more to the situation than what's being said? Or is this just another case of speculation going too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this is one conversation that's far from over. And if you want more shocking breakdowns, untold stories, and deep dive investigations like this one, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because the next reveal might be even bigger than this one.